who just happened to be among my favorite colleagues, if I had favorite colleagues. So I'm going to introduce them first, and then give an intro, and then we'll go into some of the conversation. So the first of my favorite colleagues here is Allison Bethel. Professor Allison K. Bethel joined John Marshall Law School in April 2008 as a clinical professor of law and director of its Fair Housing Legal Clinic. She's a Chicago native and a graduate of Northwestern University. Prior to coming home to Chicago, Professor Bethel was the Florida Attorney General's Office Director of the Office of Civil Rights. She is a well-regarded expert in the field of fair housing and lectures and writes nationally on civil rights issues. Professor Bethel is AV rated, which is the highest rating a lawyer may receive by the Martindale-Hubbell rating system. In 2008, she was recognized for outstanding service to the law school, and in 2020 for outstanding service as faculty advisor to the Black Law Students Association. Our second panelist is Sarah Davila-Ruhaak. Professor Davila-Ruhaak is an assistant professor of law and co-founder and director of the International Human Rights Clinic. Professor Davila-Ruhaak has also worked as a pro bono attorney with the Institute for Justice and Democracy in Haiti. She has litigated human rights cases in both domestic and international arenas and has engaged in impact advocacy at the United Nations. She has led the clinic's work on behalf of Haitian cholera victims suing the UN, immigrant detention conditions and solitary confinement, inter-American litigation, human rights trafficking of Puerto Rican victims, Human Rights for Syrians Initiative, and most recently, the Environmental Human Rights Project. Finally, Professor Renee Hatcher. Professor Hatcher is a human rights and community development lawyer. She is an assistant professor of law and the director of the Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Law Clinic at UIC Law, a legal clinic that provides free legal support to grassroots organizations, community-based businesses, cooperatives, and other solidarity economy enterprises. Professor Hatcher is a member of the leadership team for Resist, Reimagine, and Rebuild, or R3. She is also a board member for the New Economy Coalition and a board member for the Society of American Law Teachers, and is a member of Law for Black Lives. So during today's conversation, I'll be asking each of the panelists to lead us in addressing a topic, and then the other two panelists will then have a chance to add their thoughts. We'll do this a couple times, and then we'll turn to any audience questions or comments. So remember, if you have any questions, please write them in the chat, and Miller will keep a queue for us. In your questions, please remember to identify yourself and to identify whether the question is directed towards a specific panelist or to the group in general. So this series is called Law in the Time of Coronavirus and started in March when we were all trying to deal with the novel coronavirus pandemic. But we are also in the throes of another pandemic, structural racism, and in particular, structural anti-Black racism. In May, most of us learned for the first time of the killing of Ahmaud Arbery, a shooting death that had happened in February, but we learned about because of video that was released publicly in May. Later that month, police officers in Minneapolis killed George Floyd. That death was also captured on video. Breonna Taylor had been killed in March by police officers executing a no-knock warrant in the middle of the night. We have no video of that, but since we've, as a public, come to learn about these deaths, we've seen massive protests and uprisings around the country. We've also witnessed a public reaction and support for the Black Lives Matter movement that's unprecedented. So in society, we've started a conversation about structural racism in terms of policing, but I want to use our time today to try to bring together the two pandemics that we're experiencing in the moment, the coronavirus pandemic and the pandemic of structural racism. So by talking to the three of you, today we aim to discuss the many and varied ways that structural racism manifests itself, for example, in housing, in immigration, in community development, and how communities already in precarious positions because of racism are now the most vulnerable in the face of COVID-19. So Allison, I wanted to turn to you first to begin this conversation. And I'm going to kind of bring it back out a little bit. In terms of your area of practice and the clinic's work, we know that there's been a long history of race discrimination in housing, and that history led to the 1968 Fair Housing Act. So we know that racism, and particularly anti-Black racism, is nothing new. But racism survives because it tends to evolve and shield itself from regulation and legal remedies. What does housing discrimination look like in 2020?
Well, thank you for that question and inviting me to participate on this panel, Professor. I also appreciate those who have taken time out of their day to come here today and listen to this, and those who may be listening later, because housing discrimination plays such a key role in all of our lives, and I think we've seen it in a new light here in the pandemic. Today, housing discrimination is just as ugly and evil as it was 50 years ago. Many of you may not remember, other than what you've read in your history books, but prior to the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, in addition to the protests that Kim mentioned, we were basically seeing very blatant racist policies. People would sometimes say they would actually slam the door in your face of a potential housing opportunity. Today, we don't have as many of the slam your door in the face policies. They are a little bit more subtle. But they are just as evil and destructive to the social and moral conscience of our country. Policies that are designed to keep the races separate, to keep the residential segregation that exists in so many of our communities the way it is. Housing discrimination has actually been on the rise during recent times. Last year, or excuse me, 2018, which is the last year we had statistics for, it was estimated there were 31,000 reported instances of discrimination, 31,000. It's actually estimated that the number of incidents is higher than 31,000, more along the lines of 4 million, but there's a gross underreporting of housing discrimination, in large part because people don't know it even happens to them. The activities are so subtle that it isn't until literally you are out on the street or living in a dilapidated a neighborhood or housing that you realize what has happened to you. We have seen an increase in hate-related housing activities such that we have never seen before in these times. A reported rise of about 15% in hate-related housing activity. Housing discrimination has caused the segregated housing patterns that we see today. It has caused the separate and unequal neighborhoods that we have. The neighborhoods that make it easy for over-policing and other civil rights abuses, as we've talked about, for law enforcement. It makes it easy to burden minority neighborhoods with environmental pollutants and things of that nature. It has made our most vulnerable citizens more susceptible to the ills of the coronavirus. Our neighborhoods are literally choking and cannot breathe from the effects of the racism. Let me
Well,
give you
go
some
ahead.
specific examples, actually, that we've seen here in the clinic since the pandemic started. Would that be okay, or did you have a question,
No,
Kim?
no, please go ahead. Please go ahead,
Yeah, I
Allison.
want to just share a couple of cases that have come our way that may hopefully may illustrate some of these principles. So one case that we are fighting right now involves a home, a single family home in a village, in a predominantly white village in Cook County. This home is wanting to serve, is actually needing to serve children who are in the foster system in Illinois who have tested positive for COVID, or whose foster families have tested positive for COVID, such that they cannot remain in their foster homes and need to quarantine. These children are from troubled family circumstances. That's why they're in the foster system. These children are predominantly children of color. These children are in desperate need of a safe place to shelter and quarantine. Yet the municipality where they are located does not want them there and has basically imposed a number of zoning regulations, building codes, and other rules that they must follow in order to get approval to be there. These are the kinds of cases that we are fighting in the midst of this pandemic. This is how we see race discrimination in housing in the pandemic, where we would rather have these most vulnerable and very needy children, I guess, presumably out on the street, since they have nowhere else to go, rather than having them in our home. And today, these are the kinds of policies that perpetuate the discrimination, the unequal neighborhoods that we see. Zoning policies, building policies, crime-free nuisance policies. A lot of the policies are given names and sort of disguised as good things, but when you pull the mask back, if you will, you see how ugly and evil they are and how they perpetuate this tragedy that we have in our housing situation today in our country.
Thank you, Allison. I just want to kind of highlight one of the things that you were talking about earlier. When we talk about race, right, what I try to remember my students when we begin talking about race in the classroom, race itself is not an actual biological or genetic sort of thing, right? Race is a social construct, but regardless of the fact that it's a social construct, we know that it has material consequences. And so when we're looking at things like housing segregation, when we're looking at things about the social determinants of health, we talk about race, or we use race as ways to measure those things, but it's not, and I think that we need to make clear, right? It's not race that makes these outcomes happen, right? It is structural racism that makes these outcomes happen. And yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you look at where we got to, or how we got to where we are today, in terms of the separate and unequal neighborhoods, it wasn't by accident, okay? There were, and frankly remain, very well thought out government and private policies that facilitated this separation. And it did more than just facilitate the separation, Kim. It set up a cycle that pushes these populations into poverty and keeps them there. One of the things that is critical to understand is that the policies that separated the races, that separated people based on these factors, basically prevented groups of people from accumulating wealth for generations. Wealth in the form of owning a home, of home ownership, which is the way that most Americans in any way have built their wealth. For generations, these vulnerable populations have been deprived of that opportunity, not by accident, but through very, very carefully crafted policies. And so now you see these groups of people trying to climb out of that hole, but being unable to because of the continued systemic racist policies that we have in our housing market. Indeed, it is estimated that the racial wealth gap between blacks and whites earn 10 times as much as blacks, and a lot of it having been accumulated because of their home, because they had the opportunity to own a home. And this, I might add, contributes to what we are seeing today and what we saw back in 1968 prior to the passage of the act. You mentioned that we saw protests, that we saw riots, that we saw civil unrest like we have never seen it before. And this is because it was a bubbling up, if you will, of frustrations, right? From the oppressive tactics that had been imposed, that it just bubbled up and exploded.
Thank you, Allison.
We are at that point now, too, where we're seeing another explosion.
Yeah, thank you, Allison. I want to bring in our colleagues, Professor Sarah Davila-Ruhaak and Professor Renee Hatcher. Their work may not have to do specifically with housing, but their work in human rights and in community development certainly does sort of overlap with the conversations that we're having today. I want to give an opportunity for either of you to jump in. If not, then I can just move on to sort of a next kind of question that will go to Professor Davila-Ruhaak.
I mean, I think if we can go back to sort of how the racial, how we perceive racism and what it really is, and maybe this will segment into the sort of next question, but I wanted to start at least from a human rights perspective, how we define racial discrimination, because I think it is an important definition to talk about. Also, the Fair Housing Act has incorporated human rights language and protections, and so I think it's a good sort of connection. So the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination defines racial discrimination as any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on color, race, descent, or national or ethnic origin. And so I think this is really important, right? It's not just about our race, but it also has to do with how governments classify us and how we self-identify. And I think that it's important to understand that it's not only a duty of governments to prohibit and end discriminatory policies, but also to take affirmative actions, to take steps that will end racism, and not just from government officials, but from private actors. And so in human rights, we're always thinking about, who is sort of the perpetrator of human rights abuses. And if we think about all these different spaces where discrimination is happening, whether it's for housing, education, health services, we have to think, what are the policies that perpetuate these relationships between dominant voices and non-dominant voices, and who is marginalized in that relationship.
Thank you.
Yeah, and if I were just to add anything, but I'm happy to move on to the next question, Kim, just to highlight a couple of things and build on what my colleagues have said, Professor Bethel and Professor Davila-Ruhaak. I think this is really important conversation to have, in part because often it's the law and legal systems that legitimize systems of racism, that build our state institutions, and not just what the black letter of the law actually says, but also the implementation is often a part that gets missed. And so in listening to Professor Bethel kind of ground us in the history of housing discrimination, I think it's important to remember they're not just individual acts of discrimination that happen, which is the limitation of what our legal system is actually willing to address and to willing to recognize, but that there are systems and policies that continue racial discrimination, and not just in housing. And think about, for example, different housing policies, but also thinking about economic development more broadly. We know that economic development and what cities at the local, state, federal level have done have also provided certain benefits to certain communities and burdens to others. Certain disinvestment in certain communities, right? Racialized communities, Black communities, Latinx communities, and certain benefits and support systems and access to non-communities of color. And so, in thinking about this, I think it's important just to recognize that there are current systems at play. There are things, for example, like the statutes behind tax increment finance, which is just a tool of economic development that is essentially has been used to benefit affluent white neighborhoods when it was actually intended to support disinvested communities of color, to actually spur development in those particular neighborhoods. And then obviously there's so many different connections between these different pieces. And so I just would say that that's an important part, but more importantly, us as lawyers, as law students, it's really important to think about the role currently and historically of the law in all of this.
Thank you. I think that's absolutely true. One of the things that I am working through in thinking about teaching in the fall, in just a couple weeks here, less than a couple weeks, is how to sort of expose some of those sort of hidden effects of the law, right? How the law serves to support a system where there are qualified winners and qualified losers. But I want to turn back to Professor Davila-Ruhaak, because one of the things, I mean, I think that we can certainly kind of critique the law, right? But one of the things about my work as a law professor and the scholarship that I do and the scholarship that I read that I've found really useful over the last years of my professional career has been the work in critical race theory. And while we in the United States have a particular history regarding sort of anti-Black racism, slavery, Jim Crow, we also have been able to develop through that experience, I think, a deeper, very reflective sort of body of scholarship and thought around race. And Professor Davila-Ruhaak, you work in sort of mainly in the international system. And I know that you do a lot of work in particular in the regional inter-American court. And so I wonder if you could speak a little bit to maybe some of the similarities and maybe also some of the differences between an American, that is a United Statesian of American sort of understanding of race and a Latin American experience of race and racism.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think throughout my clinic work and scholarship, I'm always trying to sort of think about the experience here in the United States and how we perceive injustice and race and ethnicity and sort of linguistic access and who we are, right, as different groups, and then also the connection with what is happening in different regions of the world. I think in terms of race and ethnicity, the United States has had a different experience than some Latin American countries. Because race is a social construct, we think of race differently, right, in different countries. And so while in the United States, it might have to do with how you look, what boxes you check, right, in all these government documents. Are you multiple races? Are you one race? In Latin America, it tends to be a different question, right? Are you more indigenous? Are you, in human rights, we call it Afro-descendant, but Black? How is your hair, right? What language do you speak? And so the experience of the mestizo, which is sort of this combination of races and identities, takes a different place. Latin American countries have really sort of taken pride in sort of creating a homogenous society, and have denied the possibility of any sort of racial, ethnic groups of existing and being recognized under the law. And it creates a different conversation. And so throughout my scholarship, I have been thinking about who has a dominant voice and who is in a non-dominant position of power. How does vulnerability take place, and how do we address it with human rights? And so I think that it's so important to think about our own experiences, but also how do people around the world think about their own identity and their own struggles, right, in sort of living and navigating these systems of oppression.
Thank you. I think what you're talking about is a sort of agency, right? And autonomy in sort of identity, and also life, and sort of expressing your lived experience. Professors Hatcher, Bethel, did you want to jump in here about to respond or to comment on anything that Professor Davila-Ruhaak has said? If not, then Professor Hatcher, what we're going to do is just, again, go through a couple rounds of these questions and then move to a broader question and answer session based in part on some of the questions that we've got from the audience. So just as a reminder, please send in any questions that you might have in the chat, and Miller will be keeping a queue for us, and we'll get to that towards the end of the program. So Professor Hatcher, I wanted to turn to you now. During COVID-19, you know, a lot of us have experienced hardships. You know, businesses have been closed for months. You know, people are filing unemployment claims, et cetera. But also during the COVID pandemic, Illinois has experienced tremendous growth in one industry, that's recreational marijuana. Each month, the legal marijuana industry in Illinois posts record earnings in the millions of dollars. The Community Enterprise and Solidarity Economy Clinic provided legal services to what under the Illinois law is called social equity applicants. But at the same time, the governor said that those the decisions about those applications will be delayed, you know, because of the pandemic. They've received an incredible number of applicants, so you know the processing time has just been extended. I want to ask you, do you see this while we're sort of seeing all of this growth and relatively little competition in the recreational marijuana industry? Is this an example of what we can call structural racism?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Kim. So absolutely, you know, I think there's so much there in terms of what's been happening with small businesses kind of in the wake of COVID, but specifically within the cannabis industry. I mean, one of certainly my concerns with the law that was passed that legalized recreational marijuana in the state of Illinois was what it essentially did was give medicinal marijuana dispensaries and businesses a monopoly on the market for at least an entire year. So there was a pilot project through a law that was passed several years ago in the state of Illinois that allowed for medicinal marijuana. There were a number of dispensaries that were operating in the state of Illinois as a result of that pilot project prior to the legalization of recreational marijuana. And what we know about those specific businesses who are or who were medicinal marijuana dispensaries and then also transitioned into the recreational market is that absolutely in terms of ownership, there is 0% ownership of entrepreneurs of color. So all of the medicinal marijuana businesses were owned primarily by white men, which is generally in thinking about entrepreneurship, what that looks like, but specific to the industry and what was happening and what is currently in place in the state of Illinois is that all of the operating marijuana businesses certainly are owned by, are not owned, let me put it that way. There are no businesses that are owned by people of color. At the same time, we know that there are still thousands of people who are currently locked up in Illinois prisons for convictions related to the same industry, marijuana convictions, right? And so while some benefit, right, from this industry, others are still imprisoned. And so that dynamic, I think, is very stark. One of the reasons why we decided to get involved and provide support to social equity applicants. And those individuals are typically folks who have been negatively impacted by the war on drugs. The state came up with a number of ways in which to get at that. And so what the folks have been benefiting from the marijuana industry in the state of Illinois certainly are not the communities of color who have borne the brunt of the war on drugs here in the city of Chicago and beyond.
Do you have any advice to the governor on how to treat the sort of backlog of these social equity applicants?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think my advice would be not to structure it that way in the first place. There was some conversation amongst the Chicago City Council to basically stop operations or not to allow operations of recreational marijuana businesses until the new wave of social equity applicants actually received their state license to operate. That did not necessarily carry the day, so we know what's in place now. But there were a lot of different ways in which I think we could have passed that legislation to make it more accessible to social equity applicants. And there's also a little bit of a loophole in the law that's passed and currently in place for kind of big cannabis businesses who perhaps have been other states who have already legalized recreational marijuana, basically to come into the market and to be qualified as a social equity applicant simply by hiring a few folks who might be from those zip codes who have borne the brunt of the war on drugs. And so I think that there are a lot of things that can be done differently. One of the positives, however, of the law that was passed, which by many accounts is probably the most progressive law around the legalization of marijuana of any state, one of the positives is that it actually requires the state periodically to do an equity assessment of who the licenses are going to, what the ownership structure looks like, what the employee structure looks like for the industry, and then to report back. And the hope is that depending on what those reports look like, that there might be shifts and changes to actually make it a more equitable industry in the state of Illinois, given what we know is the history of that particular industry. And then if I could just say, just really quickly in terms of the larger picture with small businesses, the pandemic has hit minority-owned businesses hardest. We know that minority-owned businesses are twice as likely to be at risk of closing. Right now, we know that they're less likely, for example, to receive a loan, and particularly those businesses that are really based in community. So for example, in terms of actually benefiting from the support through the PPP program, through the federal program, we know that small businesses that are bringing in less than $250,000 a year, which is not nothing, certainly, especially for a lot of the clients that we work with, were less likely to actually receive any funding from the PPP program. More broadly, you know, as Allison said, in terms of wealth building, minority, Black and Latinx businesses are less likely to have substantial or enough startup capital, in part because they haven't benefited from intergenerational wealth building in the same way. They have problems accessing capital, are less likely to receive a loan from traditional lenders, and, you know, continue to experience and probably will be less likely to survive as we eventually see our way out of the pandemic. And also their minority-owned businesses tend to be in those industries that are most disrupted by COVID, like service industries, things that kind of require a lot of contact. And so we know that they have been and probably will continue to be the most hardest hit, and that they were less likely to receive funding, at least through certainly the federal program, in part because of how it was structured.
Oh, sure. Sorry. I'm going.
Thank you, Professor Hatcher. Any comments from the other panelists?
Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
No, I just wonder, because I do like to think that we will get on the other side of the pandemic at some point. And there is going to be a need to rebuild a lot of these communities and rebuild them in hopefully a way that will improve resources and opportunities. So I was wondering, in the marijuana legislation, is there any provision basically for some of the state and basically government revenue that is realized from this being cycled into rebuilding these communities that have been devastated by years of racism as well as the pandemic, building them in a more, in a better way, rebuilding them?
Yeah, thanks for that. So that was one of the positives of the law. There is a provision essentially that a certain portion of the proceeds or the state generated revenue from the industry will be reinvested in certain zip codes that have been hardest hit by the war on drugs. We've yet to see what that will look like. We've yet to really fully understand exactly what that investment will be in terms of, you know, the scale or the number. But you know, within the legislation, certainly there is a provision that says that the state shall do that.
And I think we have to keep our eye on that, right, to where that ball lands.
Professor Davila-Ruhaak?
Yeah, I mean, I think when Professor Hatcher was talking, I was just thinking about our clinic clients and the challenges that they're facing with accessing sort of legal protection, access to justice in terms of their cases. I think that underrepresented communities are suffering from disparate impact, right? They tend to work in more service-oriented and transportation-oriented jobs, live in more crowded households. Aging is different in terms of the sort of stress factors affecting physiological aging. And also immigrant, undocumented, asylum seeker persons are afraid, right, to go to the hospital due to contact tracing. They're afraid to really reach out outside of the home. And I think this is really difficult. In a time where remote lawyering is challenging, it is even more challenging for pro se litigants, right? In immigration and asylum offices, we are still filing largely in paper and in person and via mail. And so what was a really difficult obstacle and access to justice, now it is almost insurmountable for some people who not only are afraid, don't have the support system, but also have linguistic, right, limitations with limited English proficiency. And so I think that connecting, right, sort of the structural racism to the pandemic and sort of increasing obstacles is really important when we're thinking about our lawyering and how we can be engaged in the work.
Certainly. I mean, not only do we have all these, very kind of acute things that we have to worry about, we've also got, the systems that do exist are even harder to access because of the limitations of the coronavirus pandemic. So now we're going to just start round 2 of these questions for each of the panelists. And just a reminder for those of you who are participating in the audience, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat. I'm getting news that there are no questions in the chat yet. So just a reminder if you do have any questions, otherwise, I'm happy to, because I've got lots of questions for the panelists, I'm happy to keep asking them. So Professor Bethel, back to you for kind of the top of round 2. This is a very specific question, but I think it ties into some of the things that we've been talking about. We do have laws, we do have programs, we do have policies that are meant to help people in times of crises, like these in particular. But I want to ask you about an announcement that President Trump recently made about a moratorium on evictions. Will that announcement that he made help your clients? And I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah, there have been, a number of both federal as well as state and local holds, if you will, on evictions, foreclosures, and these types of proceedings. So they certainly are helpful in the short term because, of course, many Black and brown people, immigrants, women, all of our most vulnerable members of society working in jobs that have been either eliminated or impacted by the virus have had trouble paying their bills. And of course, with the unemployment situation being what it is and those benefits going out, they are definitely hurting in terms of paying their rent. So this will give them some temporary relief, and it is giving them some temporary relief, but it is sort of like just stopping the tsunami that is going to come when these protections are gone. Everyone is predicting that unless we are able to work some magic and work some deals, that we are going to see massive evictions of very, very vulnerable populations once the moratorium is lifted. Most of the people that we serve are people that are impacted by the financial consequences of the pandemic. And I think one thing that we're beginning to appreciate is the way that we are all really bound together by this. Because when these people are evicted and unable to find other housing, right, they will become homeless. They will live in overcrowded situations and crisis housing like shelters. Perhaps some will go to prisons. Some will go to other facilities if there's anywhere to go. But it will result actually in the virus being spread even more as people are basically thrown out on the streets when the moratorium is lifted. So yes, the moratorium has been helpful, but coupled with we need more in order to prevent massive homelessness, disruption in people's lives. And this, I might add, is frankly one of the few bright spots in federal policy relating to housing that has come out in a long time. Many of the other policies implemented or actually formed by the administration, even during this pandemic, have done more harm than good to the populations that we serve and that we're talking about today.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you. Sorry, can I add? It's just like, I think what Professor Bethel was saying was so striking to me because I think we don't think of the connections between housing and so many other human rights, right? So housing is a social determinant of health, right? It affects how people have access to health facilities. It affects overcrowding. It affects the quality of life. It affects education, whether children will be able to do remote learning, whether parents are going to be able to work, right, under very difficult circumstances. And so I think that we have to think broadly in terms of the effect, right, and the interdependence between housing and so many other aspects of people's lives, right? People are not just their housing and paying rent. People are not just their business or working a service-oriented job. People are not just like whatever, right? We all have our different facets and we're all exposed to different factors. And so I think connecting that is really important. And I think that we need to have that holistic understanding of how people's living situation, right, will affect not just their cases, but their life in general.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the reasons I'm so happy we're having this conversation is because it's a moment to kind of take stock about what's happening, sort of, even though we're all kind of still mainly at home, you know, what's happening in sort of outside in the world. We're engaged now in a conversation about race and policing in ways that are sort of more direct and more explicit than ever in the past. But in focusing so much on policing, I think we might be missing a moment. And so I'm glad we have this conversation today to talk about how structural racism appears in other facets of our everyday lived experiences. So thank you for joining us in this conversation. So Professor Davila-Ruhaak.
One more thing I
go
want
ahead.
to say, if I may, on the moratorium. In Illinois, some of the governor's directives not only address residential properties, right, but stopped evictions on commercial properties too, for a time. So when you, and many businesses, of course, that couldn't, some of the businesses Professor Hatcher was talking about who couldn't pay their rent, maybe some of them shuttered their doors, but maybe some of them continued to try to operate. Those businesses will now be, when the moratorium is lifted, will also be, you know, out on the street unless they are, you know, able to come up with the money that's owed in back rent and so forth. So it's really sort of a domino effect that it's going to have on people's, you know, home lives, on people's businesses, and then on society as a whole, as it facilitates the spread of this deadly virus.
Yeah, and I think what we'll see, as you're predicting, Professor Bethel, is that folks who are already in very precarious positions are going to sort of face the brunt of all that collapse. Professor Davila-Ruhaak, I kind of wanted to, again, kind of take a step back and talk a little bit more generally about the work that you and our colleagues on the panel here do in the clinics, the community clinics at UIC Law. The community clinics, as we know, provide direct service and advocacy in the form of client representation, but they also engage in advocacy in the form of educational campaigns in the community, right? You all are always in the community talking to people, and in many ways, that's how you get some of your clients. So could you speak a little bit as to how COVID-19, and I think you talked about this already a little bit, but could you talk specifically about how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted your ability to do community outreach and what sort of impacts that has on you know, the communities that you serve?
Sure, thank you. So first I want to say that I think that the work that we're doing at the community legal clinics is really important. I think that if I can just do a plug-in, I think it's a space where students can learn how to engage in lawyering and advocacy in a way that is sort of where they can have a growing experience. And so I think it's a space for students to learn how to engage in the work, right? We always say, well, how can you be involved? And I think the clinics is a great space where they can do that, but also working on real issues, right? So in terms of the impact of COVID, it has been really, really difficult to do community outreach. Normally we go to different communities in person and we connect with community organizations that then have sort of the people they serve. And so we have had to connect more with the organizations instead of sort of broadening the impact. I think that during this time as clinicians, we have to think, well, what will my sort of work look like? Will it look the same? Will it change, right? To address some of the issues that we need to be talking right now. And I think it's a very sort of individual journey that we all have as clinicians. For me, I feel like we will continue doing some asylum representation, but we will also work some projects on the suppression of the protesting in terms of privacy and human rights. I think it's really important that we continue to serve communities and reach out to them and sort of be very proactive, but also address sort of what is happening now and how our law students, our community members can be engaged now, right? To feel that they're part of something. Because I think that's really what moves us, right? And what is so fulfilling about doing this work.
Thank you.
You know, actually, for us, and we have a very robust outreach program supported, of course, by our HUD grant. I think for me, it has been, frankly, a bit of a bright spot in this pandemic. As Sada said, it's definitely been challenging, but I have to say that my students have risen to the challenge. Necessity, right, is the mother of invention. And I probably shouldn't say this on the webinar, but maybe we're a little stuck in the mud in our education and outreach. And this has sort of prompted us to look at new ways to do it. And I have been thrilled, really, with some of the ideas that the students have come up with for enhancing our education outreach that I don't think we would have but for this crisis. I will say that I find that virtually it really is hard to build the kind of relationship and connection that sort of one-on-one that you really need with people in order to make the kind of impact that we want to have, that we need to have in order to change things going forward. So it's definitely challenged us to think of new ways to do things, new strategies, but it has created, new challenges too. So I'm looking forward when we get on the other side of this to perhaps have a program that combines the best of both.
Thank you. So Professor Hatcher, my kind of second question to you is again about sort of the work that you do at the clinic. Much of the clinic's work is about promoting self-help capacities for underserved and under-resourced communities. This summer of our two pandemics has witnessed uprisings that have led in some cases to damage to private property. We've also seen a growing public debate about the role of police. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about what that tension looks like on the ground, in particular for your clients.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So there's so much. There's so much nuance. I mean, in some ways, I've been extremely, and we represent, grassroots community organizations that have been working for years or decades around issues of systems change. We represent community-based businesses, some of which experienced some damage as a result of some looting or actions that were taken by certain individuals. I am hesitant to always connect those two, the people that are in the streets that are protesting, rightfully so. And then also those who might be, committing different kinds of property damage, but also really think that it's important for us to put that into context in terms of what politically that means, what that's looked like historically, and also in this moment. So there's a lot. I mean, I think one of the things that I'm very encouraged by is that in working with organizations and organizers who have been protesting, it's not just over policing. It's not just simply in the ways in which the police have actually harmed people and communities, but it's also connecting police or state-sanctioned violence to state-sanctioned economic violence that we know that these communities have experienced for years. And that in part is like what people are saying when they say, well, this country has looted Black communities. That, you know, in thinking about what the policies, laws, and systems and how they've actually played out in Black communities have been looted. You know, Black labor has been looted by fact of slavery, or, you know, and different institutions and Jim Crow laws and vagrancy laws. And so I think this moment is really encouraging in so many ways and positive to a certain extent. But then also, you know, obviously a number of people, of our clients, whether they be nonprofit organizations or for-profit organizations, are really experiencing a difficult time just in terms of sustaining themselves and sustaining people. But we've also seen like very beautiful solutions just to meeting people's material needs. There's been so much mutual aid work that's happened. And that's coming out of, you know, a lot of community organizing that existed before the pandemic or before the organized protests that we've seen recently. And so in balancing this tension, I would say the other thing that I just want to mention in terms of the tension is that we've also seen that businesses in communities that are rooted in communities, meaning that the owner of that business might live in that community, have relationships in that community, those businesses have been protected by community members, by, you know, folks who have relationships. And so, I mean, I think relationships in part have been one big key factor in just seeing how some of these things have played out. But more broadly, what I hope is that all of what COVID has exposed in terms of racism and anti-Blackness, in terms of unequal access to resources, and also the protests will help us to reckon with our history, reckon with the present, reckon with white supremacy, reckon with the way in which policy and law does not work for some, and the way in which power is usually a determinant of who gets what and who has access.
Sure, and that's a really hard thing, I think, for us as law professors. It's been hard for me as a law professor to sort of teach that to students, right? We're in a law school and we're supposed to be teaching, in my case, you know, doctrinal law about the criminal law. And we're supposed to teach that these, you know, systems exist, and we're supposed to teach the process and procedure. And that oftentimes sort of, you know, is translated by our students or understood by our students. So that we have a working system, right? This is the way that it works, it operates, right? This is what we're teaching our students to do. But I think one of the things that I've been wrestling with over the last few years is, how do I teach the students what's outside of the law? That the culture that we create outside of the classroom, outside of the courthouse, outside of the legislature even, right, is sometimes more important, or at least is equally important to the ways in which we process and interpret and can argue the law. And that's our role, right, as lawyers. Thank you all so much for your contributions today. There are a couple of questions in the chat before we close. The first comes from Eric Fatima, and she says, here's an example of the disparate impact of COVID-19 in communities of color. On the South Side, most ATM machines are closed, and the currency exchanges where people cash their checks because they don't have bank accounts are also closed. So people are traveling 3 or 5 miles away from their home. What can be done about this? Is this legal, she asks.
Yeah, so Erica, unfortunately, this is legal. And it speaks to a little bit of what I was trying to say about how economic development works and who has access even to certain amenities or certain kinds of access, in this case, banking, right? So we know that Black and Latinx communities are currently always and historically underbanked. And we can talk about that in terms of thinking about things like access to home ownership, as Professor Bethel was saying, in terms of redlining, but more broadly, just in terms of being able to access banking services. And unfortunately, there is a very strange process in place in which that basically plans development and also make sure that there are certain institutions in communities, or that everybody at least has some access to certain institutions or businesses that they need. In this example, banking services.
Thank you. And we've got one question left in the chat. This is from Laura Darby. It's directed to Professor Bethel. Professor Bethel, could you also discuss the president's revocation of the Obama rule on, and this is an acronym I'm not familiar with, I'm sure you are, AFFH?
Yeah, well, that's sort of a dismal note to end on. But what I will say is that, for many years in looking at and dealing with addressing housing discrimination, we focused on what people should not be doing, how not to discriminate. But there was a second part of the Fair Housing Act that really has always been there, but that got less attention. And that's the part of the act that says you need to take government, municipalities, and so forth, need to take affirmative steps, positive steps to affirmatively further fair housing. And so that's not a negative command of thou shalt not, that's a command of what thou shalt do. The problem is that many people, we didn't really know what that meant, what that looked like. And the Obama administration helped promulgate a rule that put some face on this, that put some requirements on this, that help municipalities know what it looks like to affirmatively further fair housing. The Trump administration has recently, a couple weeks ago, basically suspended enforcement of that rule of affirmatively furthering fair housing, proposed another rule that is cleverly titled as community preservation or something altruistic like that. But when you pull the Band-Aid out, you see that it is just another sore that is going to erupt in this disease called racism. Basically, his new rule is eviscerating what has been done to promote fair housing over the last 50 years. And if I could leave folks with one point, it would be to voice your opposition to this and other rules that are coming out of the federal government, or indeed your local government, wherever they may come from, that limit housing choice and integration in these manners.
Thank you very much.
Sorry. I'm angry about that.
Yeah, righteous anger. Look, our hour here hasn't been nearly long enough to have a really in-depth conversation about all of the ways in which we see structural racism manifest itself, always, every day, but in particular in the ways that these things are heightened during the coronavirus pandemic. But I think this is just the beginning of a conversation that I'm sure we're going to continue to have in our social circles and our professional circles at the law school and beyond, and in our classrooms come this fall. I see that there are a couple more comments in the chat room that we don't have time to address directly, but we're going to have Marcom sort of save those questions, and we'll get back to those individuals about some information after the program. So thank you so much to the panelists. We're going to start the semester here in just a little over a week. And I know that in addition to preparing for classes, you all are managing your clients in the clinic, finishing up with scholarship projects, and also have various family and community responsibilities. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom today and your generosity for sharing those both. Thank you also to the MARCOM staff, including Executive Director Michael Huggins and PR Manager Miller Gray McDonald for organizing and publicizing this event. Miller has also provided very useful behind the scenes tech and admin support during today's presentation. Thank you to both of you, Michael and Miller. Finally, thank you to our audience members for attending today's conversation on inequities in the time of coronavirus. We appreciate your thoughts and your questions. Please remember that these programs are recorded and will be made available soon on the law school's YouTube page. If you missed a little bit at the beginning, or you had to miss a little bit at the end, or you just want to sort of review some of the materials and conversations that we had today. Thank you so much. And we will see you in just a little over a week here for the start of the semester. Have a great rest of your afternoon.